Hello, everybody. I'm Enrica Picardo.
And I'm Brian North. And
we have the pleasure today to present you the project that we have just done, aiming to align the Canadian language benchmarks and the Niveau Canadien de Compétences Linguistiques with the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR. Let me give you some background of the project and talk about the rationale of the study first. The Canadian language benchmarks and the CFR are two documents that have been developed in two different contexts at around the same time. They started in the early 90s and had the first draft published mid-late 90s with the publication on paper and on the PDF, the final publication, very early year 2000. And they have had some updates also in a very recent time, 2012, with some small adjustment later, and recently the CFR has had a major update with the CFR companion volume just published. This is an interesting point because the two documents have, even if they have developed without knowing about each other, as we will see, have some or several common points that allowed the possibility of starting a project to try and align their levels. So what do they have in common? They have, we can say that they have overlapping theoretical underpinnings. This is, as different studies show, both documents relate to models of communicative competences. And the conceptual model that they are informed by is that of a learner-user that operates in real world and activates competencies and strategies in order to accomplish tasks, real-world oriented tasks. The performance of that task is defined in both documents through can-do statements or can-do descriptors. And these can-do descriptors are what helps define the continuum of language ability. This overlapping theoretical underpinnings was also highlighted by the two reports that were done at the beginning of the project we are presenting on by Professor Joe Dix and Monique Burnott-Trites. And they both say that they share common theoretical basis, have a similar view on task-based language learning. And so therefore, because there is this focus on can-do statement, they have a number of similarities with respect to describing the student's performance at the various levels of competence. So there is this overlap between the can-do descriptors of the two frameworks. One important overlapping or one important similarity is that they both adopt this idea that of what is called technically backward design. That means that you work backwards from the descriptors to try and give coherence to your curriculum. So in this way, you align planning, teaching, and assessment. And both the CLB and the CFR facilitate this backward design and the criterion referencing during the course and after the course. So these descriptors are a set of ascending levels that help this process. The CLB have 12 benchmarks and the CFR has 6 levels going from 1 to 12, the former, and from A1 to C2. So the current assumptions, let's say before we started this project, and was that, and also as we saw in some publication, but it was a current assumption that there was an exact overlap, an exact correspondence of 2 benchmarks per CFR level. That's what we started with, like what was out there before we started the project. But the project wanted exactly to investigate if that was just an assumption or there was some reality in that.
And what we're talking about, therefore, is linking two different schemes. And there is a whole literature on the process of linking assessments. And there are 4 or 5 main methodologies for doing it. The first is equating. So you create 2 identical forms of the same test. And clearly that's not relevant to what we're talking about. But the second method is calibrating, which is establishing a mathematical relationship between 2 things. And this is nowadays done with the Rasch model. And it's the way that examination bodies create item banks. And it's relevant in this case because, for example, the CFR descriptors are actually a descriptor bank. They all have values, mathematical values. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And then the next version is methodology is what's called statistical moderation, which is a way of reducing subjectivity in assessment. So, for example, in the old days, in the Cambridge examinations, they used to use the so-called use of English paper with the closed tests in order to sort of even out the subjective assessments in the speaking and writing papers. More recently, there's a version of the Rasch model that has come out, which is called multifaceted Rasch modeling, which actually enables you to remove the subjectivity from assessment by treating the assessor, the rater, the judge, as one of the facets in the measurement and estimating their severity or lenience and taking it into account. So this is very relevant to trying to relate 2 different schemes based on can-do statements. The next thing is predicting, generally considered to be a considerably weaker form of linking things. It's estimating how people who took one assessment would perform on the other. Well, that's very relevant to what we're talking about, because basically what we want to say is more or less what level would this person be on the CEFR or CLB. And finally, and what's traditionally been considered to be the weakest form, is what's called social moderation. But in fact, we would argue, people who are involved in the CFR or in the CLB, that in fact this is the most important thing, because if you don't have a shared common framework, then assessments will tend to be arbitrary and there isn't really a demonstrated link to performance in the real world. So social moderation is based upon the idea that you train people in a common interpretation of the levels, using benchmarked scripts and samples to do that, and that eventually leads to having defined assessment criteria. This is extremely relevant, and in fact in the CFR and in the CLB, these type of standardization training is obviously used. There is in fact a manual for linking assessments to the CFR, which was published in 2009, and that recommends 4 stages, and the first being familiarization, which is awareness-raising exercises with the levels and things, which is a form of social moderation, creating the common framework. And then specification, which is defining or mapping the coverage of the 2 things in relation to each other. Again, that's a form of social moderation. And then standardization, which is training raters, first of all, in a standard interpretation, and then switching that to benchmarking samples of the local test that you're trying to relate to the CFR. So this is very relevant because both the CFR and the CLB have got calibrated samples or benchmarked samples that are used to illustrate the levels. And then finally, there's the idea of external validation, that you should corroborate your findings with independent data, triangulate the data, which suggests that one should be using 2 completely different methods of establishing a link. So, this has been done before, not in exactly the same way as what we're talking about, but one of the things that has happened in Europe has been a series of seminars in order to benchmark samples for either one language or for a series of languages. There was a conference held in 2005 in CEFR to do French, and then there was one to do 5 languages. And the basic idea is to have a 2-day seminar, to have over 30 people, to train them with some calibrated samples, benchmark new samples, link everything together with the different languages if you're using more than one language, and have very clearly defined assessment rubrics, assessment procedures, electronic voting, and then you have data that can be put into a many-faceted RASH analysis. And this is the basis of the design of our study.
So what did we do? How did we proceed in this project? First of all, we asked other experts to provide 2 independent reports on the linking the 2 frameworks. Then we ourselves did a mapping of the CFR and the CLB and NCLC descriptors, and it was done also, first of all, it was done by the researcher, but it was done mainly by the participants that were working in pairs through Skype meetings. Then the core of our seminar was 2-day intensive benchmarking seminars in which samples of oral production and interaction were judged, were rated using the CFR and the CLB. So CFR samples were rated with the CLB and CLC, and CLB and CLC samples were rated to the CFR. And new samples that had been produced specifically for this project were rated with both frameworks. Then there was also another individual task that the participant did at distance, which was benchmarking writing samples that we provided them, and the 2 researchers at the end did a detailed content analysis of all the data. And not just the data, the content analysis of the 2 frameworks. And then, of course, they did the analysis of the data. So how many participants did we have? As Brian said, they needed to be at least 30. We had 35 participants that were experts in either both frameworks, or at least very good experts on one and had some knowledge of the other. 20 had expertise on both schemes, and only 7 had expertise on the CFR only, or expertise on the other 7, and 7 only on the CLB only. We had English and French, and we had quite a balanced number, because we had 19 for English in the English team and 16 in the French team. The mapping tasks had been done by language, so people with the same pairs by language with the same language were mapping the task, whereas during the seminar, in the benchmarking seminar, we had 6 participants which had the good expertise in both schemes and both languages that switched groups on the second day to help to strengthen the anchoring, so to make sure that the results were more anchored. What was this mapping exercise? Well, the idea was precisely to take literally the descriptors of the CFR and the descriptors of the CLB and try to map to say which one corresponded to the other. What was done, on the contrary, in the 2 days intensive seminar was to use existing videos that were for CLB and CLC or the CFR, and as I said, judge them on the other scale. We knew already what level they were in the CFR, and we had to discover what level they would be rated in the CLB and vice versa. Or we had new videos that, as I said, needed to be judged on the 2 frameworks, but they were already calibrated as well in a certain at a certain level of the CLB and NCLC. In order for the participants to judge, they needed to be to have available very similar grids. So we had existing grids with different criteria for the CFR. This is one example. See, at the different levels of the CFR, you have range, accuracy, fluency, interaction, and coherence. But we didn't have anything similar in the CLB and CLC. So we created them with the different levels of the CLB and CLC, and the same type of criteria: global, range and control, fluency and coherence. These were created on purpose specifically for helping the raters during their work, so that they had two similar grids to use. The seminar was, as I said, a 2-day seminar, and it was pretty intense. And here you have the different breaking down of the time of one of the 2 days. So we had different samples with the different rating from one onto the other. And you can see 2 samples on the 2 languages, 3 and 2, and then again in different blocks that could be compared. What was interesting, during the seminar, one thing that I didn't say is that during the seminar, they had to judge the samples. The samples were viewed twice, but they were judged they were rated 3 times. The first was a first rating without any without using the grid, just watching the video and say what level of the CLB do you think it is, what level of the CFR, but what level of the CLB in this case. Let's stay with that because I have those data. And then they watched it again with the using the rubric, and they had the criteria, and then there was discussion in the group, and there was a third discussion to have a kind of consensus. So it is interesting to see that the things changed a lot between the individual initial vote and what happened after the second vote with criteria and the discussion with the other raters. So for example, here, what CFR level do you think the lady with the dark scarf, which is how to recognize one of the people in the video, is? And it is interesting that if you look at the green and the blue bar, they put 50% of the participants judged this production of this lady at level 7 and 8. But then, once they had their second vote after discussing the criteria with a partner, things switched. Almost 50% rated her at level 6 of CLB. And this became even stronger after reflecting on the histogram that was created. Yes, one thing that I didn't say is that they entered electronically their vote, and then they saw the second vote and they discussed, and in the end there was a final vote to see if they changed their mind or not. So this was further stronger after the reflecting on the third reflection. So Brian will talk about the results.
So from all of those activities, we ended up with 2 types of data. We have the content analysis, which is a qualitative data, and we have the assessments, which is quantitative data. And with the content analysis, we have the mapping, which was done by the participants, and there was the more detailed mapping done by us, the researchers. And in terms of the assessments, with the main data is the video samples. And there we have 2 types of information. We have the raw consensus vote, the third vote, which people agreed on. This is what, after all the discussion, this is what the room felt the person to be. And then we have the Rasch analysis, which is taking the subjectivity out of everything and also removing 1 or 2 people and 1 or 2 samples which are a little problematic. And then secondly, as a backup, we had also the homework task after the seminar, which was the written samples. So we'll look at these things one after another. On the content analysis, you can see the conclusions drawn, the overall conclusion. This is obviously simplified because it's slightly different for each skill, but the fundamental overall conclusion of the researchers and the participants, or the mean of the participants. And this is the area where there is some disagreement. If you look above and below that line, there is perfect agreement. So we're really focusing in on what is the true relationship, we would think, between levels 7 and 10 and the CEFR. Benchmark 9, it looks as if people are disagreeing, but in fact 12 participants put B2 plus or below, and 12 put B2 plus or C1, and only 6 actually put C1. So the median is B2 plus, which is the same as the researchers. So in the end, we have agreement on all but 2 points. Is benchmark 7 B1 plus or B2, and is benchmark 10 B2 plus or C1? So we now move to the seminar data, and this is just a simple way of presenting it. This is plotting the what came out in the seminar against what the official benchmarking level of that video is. So we were using CLB videos which have a stated level, and then they were rated on the CFR. Or we were using CFR videos which have a stated level, and we were rating them onto the CLB. And as you can see, it's a pretty regular progression. There are the ones in red are samples which turned out to be problematic, and they were later dropped from the statistical analysis. But anyway, 10 here is looking like C1, which is what the participants had said rather than the researchers. And B1 plus is all over the place. Barely. It's spreading from B1 to B2 plus. Now, if we look at the output of the Rasch analysis, this is a summary of the whole thing. It's a horrible thing to look at. But what you see here is on the very, very far left, you see what's called measure, which is just the scale that's produced. Then you see this thing called raters. That's the people. And there's not much difference between them on the measurement, because remember, this is the last vote. So by this stage, there's not really very much subjectivity in what's going on. The next column is the items, and there you can see CLB and CFR, which are the two scales used. And in fact, it's interesting to note that the CLB grid used was interpreted a little more strictly, was a little more difficult than the CFR one. And then we have the learners, and then we have the relationship between the two levels according to the program. And here it's what's very interesting to see is that 10 looks like B2 plus and not C1, but 7 is confirmed as B1 plus. Looking at this data the same way as we looked at the raw consensus data, you can see that it's a very, very regular development, but that there is and that B2 plus looks as if it's spanning 9 and 10. However, now I'm going to show you an even more horrible slide, but there is a reason. This is just the top end of all of the samples, with the learners on the left, and then the second column is the measure, and with the standard error, and then that I had created some cut points between the levels on the scale, which are then shown, and then you can see the results of the multifacet Rasch analysis and the raw ratings. And what's interesting is that if we look at the people who are just underneath, who are B2 plus, but were rated a 10, they are, in fact, they're just underneath the cutoff line to C1, and they're within the margin of error to C1. And the one which is in red is a problematic sample anyway, which we won't go into. It's a complicated, long story why it's problematic. So the conclusion there really is that when you take into account the margin of error in the statistical analysis, these two people could easily be C1. And so therefore, it's reasonable to say that benchmark 10 is C1, as the raw data suggested, and as the participants had put in the content analysis. Simple answer on B1 plus, 7, it seems to line up perfectly. So the conclusion, it's clearly B1 plus. There's a big gap between the A2 plus and B1 on this scale. It's a huge gap. It's a gap of two what are called logits. But on the other hand, in the blue box, you can see that there's a lot of on the level 5. This is about whether benchmark 5 is B1 or whether it spans A2 plus and B1. And you can see that you probably can't see actually, but anyway, most of there's a lot of B1 in the rating of the 5s, which you can see in that blue box. So in the end, we came to the conclusion that it's safer to regard benchmark 5 as B1, as suggested by everybody in the content analysis. So where are we now? Conclusion so far. It's a fairly straightforward relationship. The noticeable point really is that the B levels are stretching right up to and including benchmark 9. But the relationship between benchmarks 1 to 4 and A1 and A2, which had seemed extremely straightforward from the content analysis, seemed a lot less straightforward in relation to the benchmarking data. So for that, we looked at what happened with the writing assessments. And with the writing assessments, without going into detail, at the top end of the scale, it worked out perfectly in confirming the conclusions from the content and the content analysis in the workshop. And at the bottom here, it was clear that benchmark 4 is A2. And that this also includes A2 plus. So basically benchmark 5 is B1. And benchmark 3 very definitely spans over A1 and A2, whereas benchmark 2 is A1 and benchmark 1 is, as everybody's always thought, pre-A1. So the recommendation that we made at the end of the report is, as you can see there, pre-A1 is 1, 2, 3, and 4 span between A1 and A2, and then B1, broadly defined to include B1 plus, is covered by 5, 6, and 7. B2 is 8 and 9. C1 is 10 and 11, and C2 is 12.
So let's go to our conclusion. Well, the ease with which the participants were able to cross-rate onto both schemes was, well, first of all, satisfactory, I would say, for us, because as you can imagine, we were a bit worried that that would be a problem. But in reality, it was easy for them, and it worked really well during this this cross-rating, and this reinforces the validity for their fundamental function, that the idea that both frameworks describe clearly the levels of proficiency. These paired samples, in fact, they didn't seem to give apparently a difficulty to the raters, and it was very interesting that during the 2 days that this exercise was particularly useful, because the raters became better and better in the sense that it was a great awareness-raising activity for them and for us. So also part of the conclusion is that where the two schemes seem to differ the most is in describing listening. For example, the CFR descriptors suggest real-life exposure to media of different types, whereas the CLB and NCLC seem to focus more on audio recording or face-to-face situations. And a C1 listener, for example, is openly said that should be able to cope with distorted videos, but on the contrary, on the benchmarks, even at the highest level, we see that it's still the CLB are still talking about speech spoken clearly at a normal to fast rate. Conversely, at benchmark 5, they are expected to pick up register differences, idiomatic languages, and implicit meanings, whereas in the CFR, it is only at the level B1, B2 plus, and the C levels that the learners are expected and the users are expected to do this and to pick on these differences in language. So it was a very interesting project, I think, and very rewarding in terms of the results. And in a sense, it confirms this parallel development that we mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. And now we see that those updates are bringing us, alongside with this project that tries and relates the two frameworks, even closer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.